Alright, hi guys. I'm gonna do a real quick detailed run through of how I do Sylestia's shading. I apologize if, since it's real time and live, I apologize if I have to stop. My cat has not seen people in quite a long time, so he's kind of demanding right now and may or may not get in my way. Alright, so I'm gonna start off with Simple Circle. And using Paint Tool Sci. This is version, and the cat's in the way already. No, I'm gonna squirt you. Oops. This is version 1.1.0. Alright, so I have my line art. I use the magic wand on strict to select around it. Alright, sorry about that. Alright, I use the magic wand on strip to select around it, and then I go to selection, invert, and change the transparency detection mode while the magic wand tool is still selected to fuzzy. I select a filler color, usually blue, and create a new layer below the line art. Then you hit Control F to fill it in, and then deselect, and as you can see, that makes the lines underneath it a little bit fuzzier. Alright, so I got my filler color in, and if you hold down Control and click the little thumbnail, it'll select. And then I create a new layer. And then I use the airbrush tool. It's on the normal setting, the fuzziest one, and usually I have it anywhere between like 60 and 70, and I go to all the way down to black. I use complete black for all the shading and complete white for all the shading, and just use the opacity slayer on the layer to adjust it afterwards. For the advanced settings, it's on min size 50%, density 78, circle, no texture, fastest quality, 0 edge, 0 density. Max density is 100%, and it's at 100 with the press on density and size. I use the bracket keys are the default one. I changed it to Z and X to adjust the size on the fly, and it just depends on the size of what I'm working on. And then kind of airbrush it to the light source. So we'll pretend it's up here. So I'll go ahead and kind of airbrush it just like you would a normal sphere. And then lower the opacity to like around the 30s, somewhere in the 30s, 35, 36. Then make a new layer. You still have the thumbnail selected, and I go to the pen tool. It's on normal, the full amount. Size is maxed out right now, but I can adjust that to wherever I feel comfortable, no specific size. Oh, also the stabilizer is on S5. This makes sure I keep my lines not being wobbly. It does lag a little bit and takes some getting used to, but overall results in some pretty clean lines. Anyway, back to the tool. Density is at 100. You can turn off the noise. It's at 0. I just have it on there for when I'm doing other things. And then it's 160, advanced settings, fastest, and the density is on size. I also have this ink pen tool. You can make a custom tool that's similar to it. It's normal, the hardest setting, 100% density, no textures. Quality fastest, the hard and soft is at 10, and the press is at size, and the rest are all set to 0. And then you basically just do a cell shade on it. You could turn it down so you can see what you're doing to about, again, 30, somewhere in the 30s. And we'll just say that. And you can use the eraser too on hard to kind of like adjust your shading as you go. Just basic cell shading. And this is just a quick example, so I'll just do it like that. I say quick, but then I sit here and fiddle with it. Alright. So I have that, and then I make another new layer, and I go back to my airbrush, same settings as before, and I just airbrush all the edges of my shading. So just on the edge, to give it that darker edge on the side. And then again, I adjust this down to 30 or 40 depending on what I think is going to look good. And then, after you have all 3 layers of shading, you merge them down starting from the top. You can click Control and E and it merges down with the layer below it. And that puts it back at 100% opacity, so when you lower it, it's going to go even lower. So make sure you adjust your opacity before you start merging. Then I go to the eraser and I go to this setting, the one that's right below the hard one. I keep it at 100% density and I kind of just erase away on the sides a bit, just like kind of like a rim light effect, I guess. I use that term loosely. Just a little edge. Alright, so I got that. You can deselect and see what it looks like. Okay, and then I go to this setting, one more below it, not all the way soft, but just before the soft one. And I usually lower it to anywhere between 60 and 70, 72, 73. Sometimes I go a little lower if I don't want the effect to be that drastic. And I make the brush big and I basically erase away the details that I'm trying to get and soften the overall edge. And if it's furred or something, you'd go in here and like kind of add in a fur or texture or whatever you want to give it like that look. And then lastly, after I've done that, I put it on the softest edge, and then I kind of airbrush the backside. If I need to, I'll go in and soften specific corners, like if these were too hard, I go and soften those. I'll sometimes grab this layer, drag it on top, and duplicate it to darken the shading, and then erase those edges so I can keep the dark middle kind of dark, and then merge it down and adjust as necessary. And more recently too, if there's some effects that I want, I will go to this blur tool right here. On the softest setting, density is pretty high, 100 to 180, and the advanced settings are quality of 2, max density, and the blend is on pressure, the density is on pressure, the size is on pressure, and I'll like, okay, I want this to be a little blurred out. The only thing you have to be careful is it really does blur it a lot, so you might have to go back to your eraser tool and back to this second hardness setting and go and re-erase the edges because it'll blur those out. Alright, so that's the shading. I keep wanting to save, sorry. So if that's shaded, then I go back to here and I click preserve opacity, and then go to like not quite black but like a really dark gray, and Control F to fill it in, and then create a new layer above the shading layer. Then I take my white and the airbrush on the softest one and control clicking the thumbnail to make sure I have my selection. It's kind of airbrush in the general light direction and lower that opacity to like 20 or 30. And then instead of cell shading, we'll take a smaller airbrush usually and kind of refine that shading a bit and then lower its opacity down. I keep it 30 to 42, usually in the 40s so it's more visible, and then I merge those two down. Since it's a spear, you don't really need to do it, but I'll do it anyway, is you go to the eraser tool and you go to that soft, right before the softest setting, and turn the density down to like 60-ish. And then where these shadows are, so they don't get covered up, I'll go and erase the highlights. And if it's around scales, you know, you'll make little scale shapes. Or if it's fur, do it on the fur. So like erase where the shadows are again, so they don't get covered up. Alright, so once that's erased, how I like it, I'll lower the opacity a bit more just so the highlight's not too bad. Obviously, you can use some judgment on if it's a shinier surface or not, or if it's dull. Add a stronger highlight, add a cell shaded highlight afterwards. That's just for the base. And then for my third layer, I'll usually go and add that extra highlight. So with an airbrush, just concentrated. So if it's like that, or if it's a shiny, I'll put in those shinies right there. Or however, and then take a soft eraser and kind of soften out those edges and lower the opacity. And then just keep building it if you want to build it. I'm going to erase this. So you can leave it like that if it's supposed to be sparkle shiny, or however you think. Alright. And then, if it has sparkles or something, I make a new layer on top of the line art. Go to pure white and take the ink pen. I'll set the stabilizer back to 8 so it's a stronger spec. And I just kind of dot around in a random pattern. Just whatever looks good. And then after that, I'll take an airbrush, also keeping the stabilizer 8 and on the softest setting, and just kind of airbrush where these lights are. If it's too strong, I can Control Z and kind of lower that density a bit and brush it in. And that sparkles. And then you can lower the opacity and build up on it more, whatever you feel is necessary. And then for sparkles like outside, I usually put another layer above, and I take an airbrush for the base color, and you just kind of like airbrush them in. And then once they look good, then merge them to the base shape. Base color, I should say. Merge it to whatever color layer it is. And then go back and add another highlight layer with your dots, all white. And then I'll airbrush these a bit. And then merge them to this top white highlight layer. So at the end of the day, you'll have 4 layers total, not including the shiny one, because this one's just the optional for the effects. But there will be a base color layer, the shading layer, the highlight layer, and then the line art. And that's about it. So next I will show an example of the horn mutations and see how that goes. Okay, so we're gonna do the Great Satyr horns. Might just do the front ones real quick. Apologies for like the mouth breathing. I've been sick and so my nose is super stuffy and I can't like breathe through it at all. Okay, so like I said last time, transparency strict, select, selection invert, transparency fuzzy, then fill it in with our base. And then control click the thumbnail. And we get our black airbrush and just kind of airbrush that in and lower the opacity on it. Then make a new layer with the inking pen about at 40 or however, between 30 and 40, and kind of cell shade it in. Oops, didn't have it set to the S5. Okay, and I have some little indentions here, so I'm just going to carve those out. Shade kind of the underside of these, as well as the upper side. And this is just like the basics of how I do. If Feel free to do your own sort of interpretations. This is just kind of a rundown of the general style, but if there's something you think I'm lacking or something you think that'll improve it a little bit more, feel free to try it out and get that, like, you think there's something that you can add to give it more texture or depth or anything like that. Alright, so these are really simple and easy. So there we go. And sometimes I kind of overshade because I know I'm going to erase it, so I kind of want to give myself that buffer. Right, and lower it a bit more for my tastes. And then another airbrush on the edges now. And I'm going to do the underside or anywhere that I think is going to be a little darker too. So along the edges, and if I like this underside of this line will be darker. These horns are pretty much just along the edges of the shading. Edge, 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 edge. And lower that opacity. Then merge all the layers. Give it a quick save. And then go to my eraser. Keep the density up and go to that second setting to make it a little softer. And then go ahead and start erasing some of the edges to give it kind of a rim light highlight. It's kind of following the line work, and not completely, but just in like spaces where the edges kind of meet. So it's not tracing the line art to give it like a hard edge all the way around, but just on some of the edges. So like I'm just doing the tips of the horns here, the back of this one, and then the top parts of these guys. This one's a little too thick. There we go. Alright, and I might do the bottom a little bit too. Okay. And on top of this one, just a smidgen. Alright, save. And then go to one more softer setting and turn that opacity down. Or density. Opacity, density, they're similar. And then kind of, I don't like how light that was, so I'm going to turn it up a bit. And then erase away. That one kind of around. Kind of erase in here. Right on top of there. And then follow inside of these horns. Alright, this one's a little softer. And then this guy, I'm gonna use the blur tool a bit on this bottom part. Because my erasing got a little harsh. So, soften that out. Okay. That's good. Now I'm going to go back and fill this in with a dark gray and make my highlight layer. First starting with the airbrush, just a general direction. I'm going to turn that up a bit. Turn it up a lot. Turn that opacity down. The next layer, more of a focused but still general messy highlight. Turn that down, merge those two, then go to my eraser, still on that setting I used to erase away on these shading, and kind of re-erase away my dark parts. So it still maintains like the softness of the general highlight, but doesn't drown out the shading. And sometimes you have to go over it a couple times to make sure it's blending right. So go, got all my edges back. Alright. Save. And finally, I'll make my third highlight layer because the other two merge down, so there's only two right now. And I'll take my airbrush. I usually use an airbrush to keep it, because even if it's small, the airbrush gets more intense, but the edge doesn't get as harsh. So I take the softest airbrush and just shrink it down to a small size. This is about 7 in paint tool size. And I want the highlight to be here, along this edge of the horn. Sometimes it takes a couple tries to get exactly what I want. Lift my pen up so the line kind of drags. Make it a bit bigger for this part, kind of dragging it down. Getting those edges a bit smaller again. Smaller still. Just putting gentle streaks at about 71% density. This way it's not like, wow, these horns are really bright, but there's still that highlight stroke, but it's very soft. Then finally take my very soft brush eraser, kind of erase those edges in so they don't end starkly. These ones are kind of fine because they're just subtle anyway. Alright, zoom out. See if I want to adjust the opacity a bit. Looks pretty okay at 68. Merge it down. And all done. You just get to color the base layer and that's about it. And then you do the same for the other side. So rinse and repeat over and over. Alright, hope that helps. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Send me a message on Skype. Leave a comment, whatever you want to do.